Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to be back with you again. And tonight I have another very good friend of mine, Seyed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at Tehran University and one of the absolute best geopolitical analysts, particularly in this region, that is around at the moment. And he even gets a look in at the BBC and the various mainstream media outlets, which is a miracle these days. Mohammed, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
I wanted to start with the American kind of attempt at shock and awe. In the early hours of Saturday morning, the 3rd of February, they carried out strikes against what they claim to be 85 targets using 125 missiles fired by B-1 bombers that launched from Qatar, Jordan, and Kuwait, according to information that I have from inside Syria. Now, the Iranian ambassador to Damascus has made it very clear that no IRGC sites were targeted. And no IRGC military personnel or advisors were killed or injured in the attack. And in reality, the target seems to have been Syrian Arab Army positions and ammunition and missile depots, civilian infrastructure, particularly inside Syria. Deir ez-Zor was without electricity for some time after the attack when the Al Mayadeen power station was targeted. And of course, the PMU forces, the Iraqi resistance forces that have been instrumental in battling terrorism inside Iraq and on the border with Iraq and Syria. And at the same time, perhaps coincidentally, ISIS, terror group, started to carry out attacks against the PMU positions in Anbar province and in the northeast. So what can we take from this, Mohammed? What was this attack all about, and what was it supposed to achieve?
Well, what is clear is that the attack had nothing to do with so-called retaliation, because the group that carried out the strike against the American forces, which is, of course, an illegal occupation force that is training ISIS elements and tribes that fought for ISIS and were loyal to ISIS to strike Syrian army troops. Those people who carried out the strike on the United States, they were not targeted. These groups, this resistance, they have drones, they have missiles, they are spread out, their ammunition is underground, well protected, like in Yemen, like in Gaza, like in Lebanon. What the Americans did instead was they attacked Syrian government positions, as you rightly pointed out. They attacked Iraqi government positions. The Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq are part of the Iraqi armed forces, and they led the fight against ISIS. And you rightly pointed out that as soon as the Americans carried out these attacks on Iraqi government positions and destroyed Iraqi government property and killed Iraqi government-funded soldiers, ISIS carried out 4 attacks, which was definitely not a coincidence. In the case of Syria, the Americans did the same. They attacked bases that are well known that are there to protect the public against ISIS militants that are trained by the Americans, and which in Al-Tanaf or other regions they're based. They go out, attack Syrian soldiers, and then they go back to those bases. And they never attack the Americans because they don't bite the hands that feed them. So what the Americans did basically was that instead of let's say retaliating against those people who carried out the attack, they went and attacked those troops that are fighting ISIS. Mm-hmm. And then also, of course, the whole notion of retaliation is meaningless because U.S. occupation forces in Syria are not legitimate. Therefore, they have no right to attack, or retaliate. In Iraq, the parliament voted for the United States to leave. The U.S. armed forces refused to do so. So they have no right to attack or retaliate, as they call it. But of course, the United States is an empire. They consider themselves to be above the law, exceptional, superior, and therefore they can do whatever they want. And the Western media, I think it's more clear than ever before, is loyal to the political order. It does not raise serious questions. It repeats what the regimes in Europe and the United States want them to say, especially when it comes to foreign policy and anything that has to do with their mainstream politics.
Mm. And of course, what has been the immediate reaction to these attacks? They have been condemned by Russia. There was an emergency UN Security Council meeting called today. I haven't seen the results of that yet. Condemned by China, condemned by Cuba, condemned by the government in Iraq. And so therefore, in your view, has this demonstration of power, was it to reignite the ground conflict by proxy in Syria and Iraq? We know that ISIS have been rebuilding their forces both in Iraq and in Syria, as you said, with the help, the training, the recruitment, the arming of the US alliance, particularly in Syria at the Al-Tanaf base in the southeast on the border with Jordan. And of course, America has been very keen on saying that the attack that killed allegedly 3 US military personnel and injured many others actually took place on the Jordanian side of the border, because of course they want to avoid the embarrassment of admitting that the bases that they have in Syria, as you said, are completely unlawful, and they have no right to defend themselves on those bases, just as Israel, as an occupying force, has no right to defend itself either against the resistance. So is the United States basically trying to do enough damage to degrade the resistance capability in Syria and Iraq of combating ISIS forces that are being rejuvenated by the US? Is this operation going to completely backfire on the United States, as it appears to be doing right now?
I think it's already backfired. The United States is becoming seen across the globe as a pariah state, just like the Israelis. And the same is true with the whole of the Western political establishment. The genocide in Gaza has shifted public opinion across the globe, even in the West. And it's not just about Israel. It's about the West that supports Israel. And when the West expands this war instead of stopping the genocide, people across the world recognize what they're doing. They understand what the American objective is. The Americans are attacking Yemen because of Israel. The Americans are occupying Syria and Iraq because of Israel. The Americans are sacrificing the interests of their own people and the people of Europe for the sake of Israel. Israel is a burden to the West, but the Americans and their allies are willing to sacrifice their own people, to sacrifice the well-being of people living in the European Union or Canada or the United States for the sake of this racist, ethnocentric apartheid regime. But the Americans do not have the ability to weaken the resistance. Why? Because those forces in Iraq and Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza, that are resisting the Israeli regime, they are all underground. Their drones, their missiles, their mobile radar systems are all underground. The Americans can fire hundreds of very expensive missiles at targets in Yemen. It will have no impact because the Yemeni armed forces will take out their missiles, strike, and go back underground within minutes. So far in Yemen, the Americans have achieved absolutely nothing. They keep bombing the same place that they bombed the time before, an old airport that no one's using, or an old military base that no one is using. The Americans have said they destroyed 20 helicopters. The Yemeni armed forces said we only have one helicopter that works. So these are all fables. This is just narrative building for a Western audience to demonstrate American power. In Iraq and Syria, the Americans have not touched the resistance. All they've done is that they've killed a number of combatants, soldiers that have been fighting ISIS. And even there, the Americans have tried to be careful because they announced that they're going to carry out these attacks in advance so that the Iraqis and the Syrians would move their troops around. But in any case, it's created outrage. In Iraq, they've announced a public mourning. There's outrage among ordinary Iraqis. And again, the most important thing is that this is being seen across the world for what it is. And that is, instead of trying to stop the genocide, the Americans are trying to help the Israelis carry out genocide. The British and the others that are supporting the Americans in these strikes, they're trying to enable the Israeli regime to continue with its genocide. This is not an Israeli genocide. This is a genocide that's being carried out by the collective West in front of a global audience. And I don't think Western regimes quite understand how it has destroyed their credibility, their image, their soft power, and their capabilities across the world.
Yeah. What is Iran's role in the support of the resistance factions? Because, you know, the rhetoric, as you well know, in the West is that everything is Iran's fault. Every single resistance faction is a proxy of Iran. In other words, they erase the agency of these resistance factions. And even the recent spate of assassinations of IRGC military advisors in Damascus, in particular, of course, the bombing in Mezeh, which is central Damascus, and the killing of 5 IRGC personnel advisors to the resistance inside Syria. What is Iran's role exactly in supporting these resistance factions, and particularly in Syria? Because, of course, again, the narrative is very much that Iran is expanding its power into the region, into Iraq, into Syria. What is Iran's intention in the region? How are they envisioning the future for the region?
Well, the West and the Western media are trying to erase history. It's like October the 7th being the beginning of human history, or the story of the Palestinian conflict with the Israeli regime. That's just fiction. In our region, the power that has invaded and destroyed is the United States. The United States was an ally of Saddam Hussein. The West gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons and all sorts of other weapons to use against his own people and against Iranians. Chemical weapons. Tens of thousands of people died, but the West never apologizes. They don't speak about how barbaric this is because, again, they are superior. They are exceptional. These elites consider the rest of us to be subhuman. So if they use chemical weapons, it's fine. They were an ally of Saddam Hussein. Then they turned against Saddam Hussein and destroyed Iraq. Then they occupied Iraq. So how can they blame Iran for what they've done to Iraq? Then they went and carried out a dirty war in Syria. They pretended they were freedom fighters. But everyone knows, we know the Jake Sullivan email, the current U.S. National Security Advisor to Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State back then, on February the 12th, 2012, where he said, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. This was near the beginning of the unrest in Syria. That means it was Al-Qaeda was already on our side. It didn't begin on February the 12th. And back then, ISIS was a part of Al-Qaeda. Later on, we had the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document, biggest military intelligence organization in the world, which said that U.S. allies in the region want to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. Another 2012 document, evidence. Well, who was that entity? It was ISIS. ISIS established its state between Syria and Iraq. And then General Michael Flynn, who was the head of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency at that time, said on Al Jazeera, of all places, to Mehdi Hassan, of all people, that the United States took a willful decision to support this. So who destroyed Syria? Who destroyed Iraq? Who destroyed Libya? Who helped the Saudis and the Emiratis carry out a decade of genocide in Yemen? It was the Americans, the British, the French, the Canadians, the Germans. So when we look at the map, it wasn't Iran. It wasn't Iran that invaded Lebanon. It was in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. It was only after Israel occupied Beirut that Hezbollah was created. It was a national resistance organization to expel the Israeli regime, and they succeeded in kicking them out of the country in the year 2000. So the United States and the West likes to pretend that none of these facts are the reason for the misery in this region. And the Americans don't want people in the West to recognize that their occupation is illegal and that people in Iraq don't want foreigners to occupy their country. People in Syria don't want foreigners to occupy their country. So they call them proxies to say that, no, it's not the Syrian people. It's not the Iraqi people. It's not the people of Yemen. It's not the people of Lebanon. They all want our occupation. They want us to be there. They want us to bomb their country. It is these Iranian proxies. But they can't hide the fact that the Iraqi resistance is resisting American occupation. They can't hide the fact that in Syria they're resisting American occupation, and the same is true elsewhere. And that is exactly why the U.S. is failing, because they may be able to convince their own people with this sort of propaganda. But if, let's say, Yemen was truly Ansarullah, if Ansarullah and the Yemeni government was truly an Iranian proxy, how could they survive a decade of genocide? The Saudis, the Emiratis, with all their wealth and the weapons of the West and the mercenaries that they brought in from the Sudan and elsewhere, why couldn't they ever take the capital? Why did they lose the war? It was because Ansarullah, or what the West likes to call the Houthis, they had popular support.
Yep.
The people supported Ansarullah. And so the Americans don't want to admit that. Western media doesn't want the public to know that because they don't have a free media. That's all a myth. It never was the case, and now it's much worse. When Noam Chomsky wrote Manufacturing Consent, which I read, I think maybe 30 years ago, it was much better than the now Western media. Now it's infinitely worse. So by calling these groups proxies, whether it's Hamas in Gaza, I mean, how can Hamas be a proxy? How can they be a proxy and succeed along with Islamic Jihad and the other allied forces in Gaza? How can they succeed against the Israeli regime, which is massacring people day and night, which has all the weapons that they need? Day and night, new weapons are and ammunition and supplies are being flown in from Western countries and especially the United States. How is it that they can't be defeated? A proxy would easily be defeated. It's because they have the support of the population. The population is against Israeli colonialism. It's against apartheid. It's against ethno-supremacism. And that's why they're successful. So the Americans will say these are all proxies, but it's all nonsense. And in fact, if they were proxies, that would make Iran the superpower, not the United States. If Iran had proxies from Tehran to the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, then I think that would make Iran the world superpower, not the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it is, of course, complete projection also on behalf of the United States that has terrorist proxies in almost every area of the world, where, of course, it's targeting nations for destabilization and the plundering of their resources. You know, we shouldn't forget that in Syria, not only is the US occupying particularly the northeast, but it's also stealing, as it has done in the last 24 hours, Syrian oil, and therefore depriving the Syrian people of energy, of fuel, of heating right now in the winter, of electricity, and so on. And one of the strikes, as we said, took out the Al Mayadeen power station in the northeast during the attack on the 3rd. Now, the US, prior to this attack, it had made many statements, the Biden administration, saying that this would only be the first of many attacks and that it would continue over a number of days. Now, we haven't seen any sign of subsequent attacks. Do you think it will end here, or do you think they are going to again be pushed into a corner where they're forced to increase what they call the deterrence? Because, for example, today the IRI, the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, targeted the Al Omar oil field, which is occupied by US military, and they killed, I think it's now up to 8 of the Kurdish Contras that were on the base, injuring a number of others. So that's one of the biggest attacks, and that's happened since the 3rd of February. And there have been other attacks, both in Iraq and in Syria, and against Al-Tanaf. Because, as you said, ISIS has been carrying out attacks. I think today it carried out a fairly big attack in the Badia area, in the central desert area of Syria, and it was repelled, and it returned to the safety of Al-Tanaf, and Russian and Syrian airplanes are now intensively bombing, as they have been for many months now, terrorist positions around Al-Tanaf. So where does the US go from here? Because, as you've said, it has backfired royally against them. It's further exposed them as the criminal entity that it is. It lied, according to Iraqi officials, that it had forewarned Iraq of the strikes. That's been denied flatly by the Iraqi government. So where does it go from here? I mean, how At what point does the US start to genuinely de-escalate?
Well, I don't know where it's going to go, but obviously things are not going in accordance to plan. In Yemen, I can say with confidence that the United States has failed to weaken the military capability of the Yemeni armed forces to carry out strikes on ships in the surrounding waters, the waters near Yemen. The Americans have failed completely. They have not touched their capabilities. As I said, those capabilities are all underground. In Iraq and Syria, obviously they failed because the fact that these strikes have continued against the occupation after the Americans struck Iraqi and Syrian positions means that these people are not deterred. And as I said to you before, those bases that the United States struck had nothing to do with U.S. forces. They are there to defend the land against ISIS. The Americans did not strike the resistance groups that have been launching attacks on the U.S. illegal bases. Those are a different set of people. So the fact that these attacks are continuing shows that the Americans have failed. These groups will continue to fight against the United States as long as it's an occupation force. So the Americans are only making their occupation more costly because they're using very expensive weapons to fight against very cheap weapons, very inexpensive weapons that are used by Yemen, Syria, Iraqi resistance, Syrian resistance, the Lebanese resistance, and the Palestinian resistance. And I should add something here because you asked this before and I failed to answer. And what is the Iranian position in all this? The Iranians support the resistance across the board. The Iranians support the Iraqi sovereignty. The Americans are an occupation force that must leave. The Iranians support Syrian sovereignty. The Americans must leave. But what the Americans did in Iraq and Syria was that they did not strike Iran or so-called Iranian proxies. They struck Iraqi troops. The Western media is pretending that this is not the case, but the people in Iraq know what happened. Yep. The people in Syria know what happened. The people in the region know what happened. In Syria, they struck Syrian troops. They did not strike Iranian proxies. So they can fool their own public opinion, or at least part of their public, because people in the West are increasingly skeptical, especially after Gaza. But it's not going to change the reality. It's not going to change the understanding of the people in the region who are much more important than the people in the United States, because it is these people who want the Americans out. So Iran supports the resistance in Iraq and Syria because they want their sovereignty back. Iran supports Ansarullah. Iran openly supports Ansarullah. When the United States was helping the Saudis bomb Yemen, when the British were sending thousands of advisors to keep the Saudi and Emirati Air Force flying, the Iranians were supporting Ansarullah, and they will continue to do so, or the so-called Houthis, as the West likes to call them. Iran says that openly. Iran supports Hezbollah. Iran's open about that. Again, the United States provides Israel with weapons to carry out genocide. Iran provides all sorts of assistance to the Palestinian people to resist genocide. By any means necessary, Iran will support the Gazan people. It's not just military. Anything that they need to defend themselves against the genocide that's being carried out against them by the Americans and the Europeans and their Israeli allies, the Iranians will do whatever is necessary to help the Gazans. But the Iranians don't hide that. They won't hide. They're not hiding any of this. Iran proudly says that we defend them, we support them. But they're not Iranian proxies. It's not possible for them, as I said earlier, it's not possible for any of these groups to be so successful if they're proxies. A proxy is not popular. A proxy takes money and carries out orders. But a proxy doesn't make sacrifices the way in which Hezbollah is making to draw this Nazi. I don't know if it's good for your, it could cause you to lose your channel.
No,
This
don't worry about
you can delete that sentence.
No, definitely not.
To draw away this Zionist genocidal army from Gaza. Hezbollah is making sacrifices. It's sacrificing its youth to spare the people of Gaza. Yemen, its people are going to the streets in the millions, supporting the armed forces and Ansar Allah, who are making sacrifices to defend the people of Gaza. These can't be. These are not proxies. These are popular liberation organizations which are making sacrifices to end the genocide. Because the West likes to present itself as morally superior, as a superior civilization. And people across the world are seeing the exact opposite. They're seeing that the Western elites are the most brutal and medieval and violent and barbaric of all world leaders. And that they are carrying out, in certain respects, the worst genocide in human history. Why is it the worst? Because it's being done in front of our eyes.
Yep.
And they're doing it proud, and they're proud of it. They have no shame.
The West is completely endorsing it, which is
Absolutely.
why they vetoed the ceasefire at the UN Security Council, and they've condemned the South African case against Israel. You know, it's extraordinary. I mean, they are literally not only complicit in the genocide now, but, for example, by the defunding of UNRWA, that makes them actually participants in the genocide, not only complicit in the Israeli genocide, but they are guilty of committing genocide by increasing the risk of starvation and disease and lack of
not the risk of starvation and disease.
Yeah.
They are creating greater starvation and disease intentionally. And this is revenge. The West is so on the one hand, they're providing the Israelis with weapons, ammunition, supplies, financial assistance, and they are now strangling the Palestinians even when it comes to food. They're starving the population intentionally, and this particular act of cutting UN aid is in revenge for the IJC, ICJ ruling. Yeah. It came literally hours after their ruling, and it is interesting that this organization lost over 150 of its employees as a result of Israeli genocidal attacks. Yeah. No one complained about that. No one condemned it. Not even the UN would name Israel. No, they carried out almost, I think they killed 158 employees, if I'm not wrong. People can search this on the internet and see if that number is correct. It's over 150. And yet, since the Israelis claim a handful of them were involved on October the 7th, the U.S. immediately cut aid. Right after the ICJ ruling in response to the South African complaint. It's obvious what this is all about. The Israelis are losing the war in Gaza. They've lost the war in Gaza. Yep. The genocide is not a victory. It's a defeat worse than the defeat that they've experienced on the battlefield. It's worse. The defeat on the battlefield is humiliating. It shows that the Israeli regime, its military is weak. The Israeli intelligence capabilities have also been exposed to be very weak. But the fact that the Israelis have openly been carrying out genocide, I think is the greatest defeat to Israel, because now Israel is despised across the world. So the West has seen that the Israelis have lost on all accounts, and they and Israel together are searching for some sort of path to victory,
Yep.
or to at least to escape defeat. So the West is intensifying the genocide, not just by supporting Israel, but also by trying to block aid from getting into Gaza.
Mm.
They're desperate. And that is why the Americans are helping the Israelis. They're preparing them for an attack on Lebanon. There's intelligence that the Israelis are preparing for an attack. We don't know if it's going to happen, but the Americans have given them the weapons, and they're building ammunition depots in the north to prepare for this. So the Americans are, and the Israelis, by expanding the war, whether in Yemen or Iraq or Syria or Lebanon, it's all being done to find a path to victory.
Yep.
Or at least an escape from defeat. But the only thing that is going to happen is that it's going to make the defeat even greater, because the resistance front is not going to back down. Their assets are all well protected, and they have yet to show their force. They have yet to show their true capabilities, because they're not seeking escalation. Even though it's interesting, they won the war, the resistance. And in case of escalation, they will win. But because of humanitarian considerations in Gaza, everyone wants the war to stop, except for the Americans and the Israelis, because they're trying to escape defeat.
Yeah. I mean, as Yoav Gallant, the war minister, said, I think it was just before Christmas, that Israel must achieve a victory in order to survive in the Middle East. And of course, for the US, Israel must survive in the Middle East because Israel is, as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has described, it's its military garrison, its intelligence center, its interference center, its bulwark in the Middle East, right? So Israel must survive to secure U.S. hegemony in the region and to block the advancement of China, Russia, Iran, and the independence of the global south, of course. The end of U.S. occupation, the end of U.S. plundering and ravaging of these countries that they've destabilized and destroyed and occupied for decades now. But I wanted to just come back to the situation in the northern occupied territories, where, of course, now also what we're seeing is the incredible insecurity of Israeli borders, right? Because their border with Gaza now will never be secure again. Their border with Lebanon, they've lost 200,000 plus settlers from the illegal settlements on the border with Lebanon in the northern occupied territories. As far as I know, settlers are leaving the occupied territories because, you know, it's no longer the homeland of security that it was portrayed to be. There is internal turmoil. There are constant protests for the removal of Netanyahu. There is a lack of confidence in Israeli military, in Israeli intelligence. The hostage testimony is demonstrating the Hannibal doctrine that was turned against their own civilians. And of course, now it's coming out that the atrocities of 7th of October, many of them were actually carried out by the Israeli forces against their own civilians to prevent them being taken hostage. So yes, I mean, absolutely, Israel's image in the world has been completely, in my opinion, destroyed. But there was talk today who was it? Amos Hochstein, who's been in Israel, of negotiation with Hezbollah over this withdrawal, what is it, to 10 kilometers from the border with the occupied territories. So it's reduced down from previously Israel was calling for Hezbollah to move north of the Litani River. Now they're saying to move back 10 kilometers. And the US is now talking about negotiations. Of course, in my opinion, Hezbollah is never going to accept any kind of withdrawal from southern Lebanese territory. And so, in your opinion, is this just smoke and mirrors again by the United States? Is this some kind of delaying tactic? Do you think Israel is stupid enough, really, to invade southern Lebanon? Or will they, for example, try to turn factions within Lebanon against Hezbollah by bombing other areas of Lebanon? How are they going to play this? Because it's suicide for them. If they can't win the ground war in Gaza against the Palestinian resistance, how on earth can they win a ground war against a far better prepared army that is Hezbollah in southern Lebanon?
Well, they can't win. They will definitely be defeated, but this is a desperate regime that, as I said, is, along with the Americans, is looking for a path to victory. There's no doubt in my mind that the Americans know that their air campaigns against Yemen are ineffective. It is very costly for the United States, and economically it's damaging the United States because now American ships can't use the Red Sea. But the Americans, they double down. I think it's called gambler's fallacy too. It's like, they keep doing the same thing over and over again, but it's not going to work. In Lebanon, it's the same. The Lebanese are not intimidated by the United States. In fact, if Israel attacks, it's going to be that the resistance will have the advantage. Right now, the resistance, in order to keep ordinary Lebanese safe, they're fighting alongside the border at a disadvantage because their troops are exposed.
Yeah.
But if Israel launches an attack, then that elaborate network of underground capabilities and all that advanced technology that they have across the country, that will be used to devastate Israel. You know Lebanon well, and so do I. What sort of strategic infrastructure does Lebanon have? What strategic infrastructure does Israel have? Israel has all sorts of targets that, if they are destroyed, it will devastate the economy. Lebanon does not have that sort of infrastructure. There's much more that there's for the Israelis to lose than for the Lebanese. All the Israelis can do in Lebanon is just kill ordinary people, which they do. They do. The Americans and the Europeans are fine with Israel carrying out genocide and massacres. What they did in Gaza is not new. They did the same thing in Lebanon in 1982.
Yep.
Sabra and Shatila, you've been, I'm sure, to the refugee camp. I've been there many times. The Israelis, along with their partners in Lebanon, who are now allies of Western embassies, they massacred up to 3,000 people within a day or so. Yeah. Women and children. 3,000 people. Nothing happened. During the invasion of Lebanon, between 20 to 40,000 people were murdered by the Israelis. In 2006, the Israelis leveled a neighborhood in Beirut. No one in the West protested. All the Israelis had to say is there was a terrorist in that building, or and the West would say this is a Hezbollah stronghold. The Israelis say so they can just bring down 15-story building. It's fine, because the West will always support Israeli genocide. They will support anything that the Israeli regime does, no matter how many women are murdered or children are murdered. The West does not care. And this is this is, I think, the most important thing, that the West is being exposed.
Mm.
The West has done this often before, but never before in human history has it been done live in front of a global audience. This is a new type of genocide. It's different from the genocide that the French carried out in Algeria or the Americans in Vietnam. This we're seeing as it takes place. We didn't even see this in Yemen. In Yemen, it was all because it's a big country and it was spread out,
Yeah.
and many places didn't have electricity, or a lot of the genocide that would happen, we wouldn't see. And also the media wouldn't cover it because sadly, much of the Arabic media was hostile,
Mm.
to the people of Yemen. The people who are now, rooting for the Gazans, back then they were rooting for the Saudis.
Yeah.
So, which is sad in itself. But the Israelis have. Let me also add a couple of things too. The myth of Israeli power is gone. Do you think that in future investors, ordinary investors from China, from Russia, from Brazil, from the global south, even in the West where they have so many problems of their own, do you think that they're going to go to Israel to invest?
Mm.
Do you think people are going to be, Chinese companies are going to invest billions of dollars in this country, which has a weak intelligence agency, which has a weak military, which is massacring people? No, that era has ended. So Israel is a diminished regime. The myth of Israel is gone. It is now seen as completely dependent on the West to survive. So some Israelis will leave because the economic future of Israel is going to be very different from the past. Many of the elites, many of those who are highly educated, they're going to look for jobs elsewhere. In addition to that, those who support Israel and these crimes that it commits, they are on the decline.
Mm.
You know England much better than I. Is England on the rise or on the decline?
No, definitely on the decline.
Exactly, and that's true for the whole of Europe
Mm.
and even the United States. It's on the decline. So Israel is a diminished power. Its backers are on the decline. This is not sustainable. It's not sustainable. And as you rightly pointed out, its northern borders are never going to be the same.
Mm.
Its southern borders are never going to be the same. And who knows what's going to happen in Jordan in the future? People in Jordan, across the Arab world, and all these countries outside of Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, and those who Lebanon, where the majority supported the resistance. Outside of that, the rest of the Arab world is looking on with humiliation because they see that their governments are supporting Israel. Turkey, despite the fact that the people of Turkey support Palestine, Erdogan is a strong supporter of Israel.
Yep.
He's doing extensive trade with Netanyahu. He just talks, but behind closed doors, he's actually compensating for the blockade that Ansarullah is carrying out. Yemen is imposing a blockade. He's exporting goods from Turkey to compensate for that blockade.
Mm.
He's exporting large amounts of steel and iron. Where do you think
Yep.
steel and iron is being used right now in Israel?
Yeah.
Oil from Baku is going through Turkey to Israel. What is that oil being used for?
Yep.
It's for the war machine.
Exactly.
So people are being exposed. The Emiratis
Yeah.
and they are helping
Bahrain.
transit supplies through to Jordan. These are facts that
Mm.
people will remember. in future.
Yeah.
So, it's like the ocean. When you look on an ordinary day out to the sea, it looks calm, like from the coast of Latakia or Lazaria or Beirut. Everything looks calm. But under that water, there's a lot of things happening under the
Yeah.
surface. So I think that the Americans, their empire is on the decline. But I think that the Americans are creating uh, an environment where in the months and years ahead, things will get much worse for the West, for NATO. And all of this is happening as the war in Ukraine continues.
Yeah.
And it will escalate in the coming weeks and months.
Mm.
So uh, these wars that the U.S. is carrying out on all fronts, it's not sustainable.
Yeah. I think just to finish off, I wanted to just talk to you about what's been happening in Iran recently with the retaliation in Erbil in Iraq and against ISIS and Turkestani positions in Idlib in northwest Syria, and also the cross-border skirmish between Pakistan and Iran. Does Iran feel threatened by US interference in neighboring countries, like, for example, Kurdistan in northern Iraq? Or even, was there a threat of US interference in Pakistan that was preemptively dealt with by Iran? In other words, to what extent does Iran feel itself under threat? Because, of course, the rhetoric has been, particularly from Republicans, been very much against Iran, and that Biden isn't doing enough against Iran to deter Iran, etc. How is Iran managing this sort of, well, I guess it is escalation against Iran itself?
The Americans are not strong enough to initiate conflict with Iran. They would not win such a war. They would lose a war against Iran. It would be devastating for the world. I think it would bring down the global economy, but the United States would lose.
Yeah.
So the only way forward is for the United States to support terrorist organizations, which they do. It's for the United States to use its hundreds of Persian media outlets based in the West that are hostile towards Iran for psychological warfare, which they've been doing for years, but now they're beginning to meet financial difficulties, many of these outlets, because the United States is running out of money, but also because the United States is refocusing on China and Russia.
Yep.
And it's the sanctions regime. The sanctions regime is beginning to weaken because countries across the global south are increasingly ignoring the West. Iran's joined BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, its relations, it's a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the North-South corridor with Russia. All of these are enhancing Iran's position because of the need for oil. Iran's been able to export everything that it can produce. So the sanctions are weakening. The propaganda apparatus is, as I said, weakening, but also because of the genocide that the Americans are carrying out with Israelis. Their whole notion of human rights and all of that has their claims about human rights and women's rights and human dignity and freedom, and all that has been exposed as sheer propaganda, because everyone sees that the Americans are massacring women, they're massacring children, they are supporting genocide. No one believes them anymore. No sane person believes the United States or the EU. The EU can, and if you've noticed, they haven't been preaching much about human rights anymore these days. During the first few weeks, of the genocide in Gaza, they were trying to carry on with business as usual, sanctioning Iran for, I don't know, human rights violations. But then after a while, they stopped that because it was becoming, people were ridiculing them in Iran. So the only real tool that they have left is terrorism. And they support many terrorist organizations. In Pakistan, we had a number of terrorist attacks carried out in Iran. During the anniversary of General Soleimani, we had the massacre that took place in Kerman. That the terrorists came in from Pakistan, and we had a number of attacks on Iranian police, even traffic police, but also border guards by another terrorist organization. All of these came in from Pakistan. And these groups are traditionally funded by the United States, by the Israelis, and by Saudi Arabia. I think I can't say for certain that the Saudis have decreased their involvement, but the United States and the Israelis are funding these terror groups, whether it's ISIS or whether it's the Jaish al-Adl group. And in northern Iraq, they also support terror organizations that have bases there. I was on the BBC a while ago. I'm not quite sure if it was Radio 4 or World Service, one of these media outlets of the British. And when I spoke about these Kurdish groups and I said, do you have proof? And I said, you make documentaries. Your journalists go to these bases in northern Iraq and do interviews with these terrorists. And you glamorize them and say these women are, fighting for their freedom. And then now you say, is there evidence? It's amazing how these people it's extraordinary. So they fund these terror organizations. And in northern Iraq, the Iraqi government does not have the control and authority that it should. They don't control the border. They don't. So Barzani and his people, they're in control, but they're highly influenced by the United States and Israel. So they allowed the Israelis to establish intelligence gathering bases, the Mossad, to have offices there, even though it's against Iraqi law.
Yeah.
And the strike in Pakistan was to block an imminent attack. And the Pakistani government was very angry, understandably so, but the Iranians had no choice. Yeah. And then the Iranians gave the Pakistani government the evidence that this was indeed a base, that no civilians were there. This was a military base. And part of that evidence was also published online. You may have seen it. It was a base where where these people carry out training and they organize, and they were they were gathering to carry out a major attack in Iran. And after the last few attacks, the Iranians could not tolerate that. So the Pakistanis, after a while, they recognized what was happening, and hopefully the two sides will work together to build an infrastructure to prevent this from happening in future, because it's not in Pakistan's interest either. Pakistan has many problems. It's very poor and impoverished. It has internal difficulties. Also, a lot of its resources are on the Indian border. And of course, Afghanistan is a big problem, and their borders with Afghanistan are even longer than ours. So that's one issue. But in northern Iraq, the Iranians struck at the Mossad bases and the terror organizations that are based there. Of course, the Iraqi central government had to protest, but those bases are illegal. Those terror organizations are illegal. There are no terror organizations in Iran that are attacking Iraqis from inside Iran. And of course, as I said, the Iraqis are against what was happening in northern Iraq, but they don't have control. The Americans are there, the Israelis are there, and they're supporting these operations. So the Iranians felt they had no option. With regards to the missile strikes in Syria, of course, the Syrian government supports it because these are ISIS-affiliated groups that carried out an attack through Pakistan into Iran, but of course with funding from NATO countries. But there was also a secondary message, because they attack those bases in the northwest of Syria, and it was basically sending a message to Israel that we could easily target you as well, because those same missiles could reach deep inside Israel. So they were both striking the terror groups, but they were also sending a message to Israel that we can strike you very easily. So Iran wants good relations with Pakistan, but Pakistan has a weak central government. Iran has very good relations with Pakistan. Iran wants good relations with Iraq. It has very good relations with Iraq, but the Iraqi government does not have adequate control over northern Iraq. But I think that in general, as I said, as I've been saying throughout this discussion, that the United States is on the decline. Its actions are only going to increase the pace of this decline, and ultimately the United States is going to pull out of. It's going to have to pull out of these areas, either suddenly or gradually. I don't know I can't say when this will happen, but I personally believe that these are the final years of U.S. domination or U.S. occupation in our region, and it's also the dying years of the Israeli regime.
Let's hope so. For the sake of the region and for the sake of the people of
Humanity.
the region, that really, yes, exactly, for everyone.
And one final point that I'd like to make is that one of the very encouraging things that we've been seeing is that so many people in the West are waking up to reality. And many of the young people who are creating awareness in the West are actually Jews themselves, young Jews who are sacrificing because they're being hit hard by the establishment. They don't benefit from this resistance. But young people, especially Jews across the West, are creating awareness, and even the West is shifting. I don't know how this will, I don't know what will happen in future, but in any case, the world has turned against the West. The region has turned against the West. Israel has been defeated on the battlefield. Its image has been destroyed. There are going to be tough days and months ahead. Many atrocities, more atrocities will be carried out by the collective West and their Israeli proxy. But at the end of the day, this is not sustainable.
Yeah, I agree. Mohammed, thank you so much for your time. I always love talking with you and listening to your insights. They're invaluable, especially at this time. So really, thank you very much for your time. And let's try and catch up. It's been a while, actually. I didn't realize how long it is since I last spoke to you, in an interview form, I mean. So let's try and do it more often as events do what they're going to do. I have no idea, actually, at the moment where the US is going to go next, but I guess we'll just keep watching and analyzing. So thank you again so much, and please take care of yourself.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope to see you soon.
Take care.